Good morning once again. Welcome to the adult Bible class. As you can see, I am here with my friend, Brother Steve Walters again. You got the opportunity to read a book that I gave you, several weeks ago called...
No, it was
May 7th.
May of 2022.
Well, so COVID time really messes me up. May of 2022, you got this book called...
Oh, the Taylor King.
Right, which was about the Munster rebellion.
Right.
And part of the idea was that, you would present that as a class, and then I roped you into teaching a couple more times on top of that, which I thank you very much for. But that is the topic of today, right. is this event, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, so. Thank you. And it's just a one-page handout that is really not about the Munster Rebellion, but it's the 12 articles of the Peasants' Revolt, which led up to the events that contributed to the Anabaptist kind of radical rebellion in Germany and Munster. And so, as usual, there's two main players in this Munster rebellion. Jan Matthias and John of Leiden cast their unrestrained vision of society where religious leaders are also the secular power. And that little moniker there doesn't really go deep enough to explain that when it says unrestrained vision of society, I would call it a radical, corrupt, crazy vision of society. So here's where we are in the church history class that Andy has been teaching for the last couple of years, it seems like. And we are in lesson 62. And on the left here, we started with why church history, and we went down through the early church and the empire and the dividing of East and West and scholasticism, and now we're in the Reformation, and we're in subtopic E on the right there, the radical reformers. And last week we talked about some of the groups that pretty much came out of Zwingli, where Zwingli didn't really agree on everything with Luther, and then there was a group of his students that took it further, and then at some point when we start back up again, Andy will talk about John Calvin, denominationalism, liberals and fundamentalists, and the contemporary church. And do you have any idea, Andy, how long it will take to finish this course?
I am hoping, praying, anticipating that by the end of 2024, we will be able to move on from church history. Secretly, I'm hoping by July of 2024 to be able to move on.
Okay. All right. So we have at least 6 months, maybe 12 more months of very interesting topics.
Right, and we'll actually do John Calvin before the break, so that will be next week.
Oh, we are going to cover...
Yep, the last...
Oh, that's right. Okay. Yeah, so the last week of November, last Sunday in November, we'll be looking at John Calvin. So for reading resources, this top item is the book that Andy had recommended to me, and I got it on Kindle electronically for pretty inexpensively. If you want the actual book, it must be out of print, because on Amazon they want like $50, $60, $80 for this book. And so that means two things: it's popular and there aren't very many copies. This is by Anthony Arthur, who happened to be a professor of English at my alma mater, which I didn't know, California State University, Northridge. Now, I graduated from there in 1975, and this was written in the 90s, or 1999, so I am very sure that this professor wasn't there when I was attending. And then I've got two other reading resources. Both of these are from Mennonite organizations, and they're both well done. Gameo and AM Network. And if you're interested in some more details reading-wise, they would be good things to read. You can also just Google the Munster Rebellion. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of people that have written stuff on the rebellion. And you've got people that think that the Munster Rebellion shows why Protestantism is bad, all the way to people that just think that the Munster Rebellion was the beginning of communism in Europe. So, there's all kinds of crazy stuff out there. But if you're interested in it, it might be worth your while. And then I only put one audiovisual resource here, and this is a class that is being taught, what I can tell, it's a Mennonite class, as the professor is up front, and what you can see in the front row are two ladies with bonnets, okay? And he uses an old-fashioned overhead projector with transparencies, and he draws on a chalkboard, and he uses an eraser. This is pretty old school, but it's pretty recent to be a YouTube video. So there's as many YouTube videos on the Munster Rebellion as there are articles that you'll find in Google. There's just many, many, many of them, from cartoons all the way to crazy people talking about it. So if you're interested in this topic, there is plenty of stuff to look at. The stuff I picked out, I thought was relevant and accurate. What I liked about this video, this YouTube video, is the instructor keeps bringing it back to the focus went away from our Lord Jesus. He's constantly showing that the basic reason that all this craziness happened is because they lost their focus on the Lord. So I appreciated that. So what we're going to cover today, and we've got a lot of material, and so I'm going to zoom through a lot of this, and I'm going to be reading a lot of it because there's so much detail that I don't want to goof it up. We're going to look at some background, what happened with the Anabaptists moving to Munster, this rebellion called the Munster Rebellion, the aftermath, and then a conclusion. So as far as background goes, as you know, and as Andy has taught, Luther posted his 95 Theses on the Wittenberg door in 1517. And I think it's been so long, 500 years is a long time. To put that in perspective, um, the, 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 the settlement of North America hadn't even started yet, all right? The first permanent settlement in North America is St. Augustine in Florida, which was around 1565, all right? So much has happened in Europe before America was even started to be founded. Closer to home, it was 1585 when the Roanoke colony in North Carolina was the lost colony, and then in the 1600s, 1610 through 1620, you've got Hampton, Newport News, the Plymouth people up in Massachusetts. So, I mean, it was almost 100 years later that a lot of the history in America got started. And I know Andy will be jumping into that later when we get into the movement from the Anglican Church to North America. So after Luther and Zwingli, who we talked about last week and prior weeks, there was the invention of the printing press and this idea that the Catholic Church wasn't always right resulted in the north part of Germany in the peasants realizing they didn't have to listen to, and they may not even have to obey all this stuff that the church had told them for a long, long time. And so they got together and they decided to try to take things into their own hands, and there was a revolt, a peasants' revolt, which was kind of the peasants against the nobility. And the 12 articles, that handout that I gave you, is kind of like the Declaration of Independence of these peasants. And it just lists out a dozen things that they were complaining about. And none of them are really unreasonable. Just like in America, when we started, our Declaration of Independence, you know, has a lot more complaints about the King of England. The result of this rebellion is that the nobility pretty much slaughtered a lot of peasants, and there was a lot of resentment in the peasantry against the nobility and against the Catholic Church. Around the same time, Munster, the town of Munster, wins their independence from the church. And what I mean by that is instead of being run by the church, it's now run by a town council and the guilds. They have a degree of self-rule, and they actually have a mayor, all right? So there are two people that are a big part of the Munster Rebellion that were already in Munster. A guy named Bernard Kipperdoling. He was a prosperous clothing merchant and guild leader in the city council, and he had become a popular leader in the city of Munster. He was a follower of the preacher Bernard Rothman, right? And that's this next guy here. Bernard Rothman, a trained theologian and Catholic pastor, preached of the Church of St. Moritz at Munster, and he starts preaching against Catholic doctrine, even though he's a Catholic priest. Stuff like the purgatory and images, as well as the low morals of the other priests. After 1529, he actually goes to Wittenberg, where he becomes a friend of Philip Melanchthon, who was the professor of Greek at the University of Wittenberg and a companion of Luther. And then he travels around in South Germany, in Speyer, and Strasbourg. And that Strasbourg becomes important later. So you've got these two guys in Munster. So the Anabaptists, as we talked about last week, wanted to take the Reformation further than Luther and Zwingli were willing to go. They were the magisterial reformers who didn't really want to break away from the church, and they believed that the government should have say over how people acted in the church. The emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V, then declares open season on the Anabaptists. And the wholesale, and this is right out of his decree, the wholesale extermination of every Anabaptist and rebaptized man and woman of the age of reason. Okay, so Anabaptist leaders that followed the original tenets of the movement were martyred. And that leaves this gap in leadership that was often filled by men of little education but much passion. Okay, and that has a lot to do also with what happened in Munster. So a guy named Melchior Hoffman is one of these passionate leaders that came out of the Anabaptists. He's a self-proclaimed Anabaptist prophet and lay preacher with no scholarly training. He started spreading the Anabaptist beliefs and practices in Holland and the Netherlands starting in about 1531. Hoffman moves to Strasbourg and preached that Christ would return there in 1533 to set up New Jerusalem. And obviously, that didn't happen. And so you've got this preacher who's extremely popular. He's an extremely talented speaker, and he has a great following. And his theology, which is kind of his own idea, is that the Bible is good, but it's not everything. And they start believing that God can talk to me, and I can be a prophet. And he gets these ideas and starts preaching them, and he ends up getting thrown in jail later. All right, so so we mentioned Bernard Rothman. So he comes back to Munster after visiting Speyer and Strasbourg, where Melchior Hoffman was, and he is appointed pastor of the Church of St. Landberg at Munster. And he really introduces the Reformation into Munster in 1531 and 1532, because he's kind of converted to Lutheran, to be Lutheran. In 1533, Rothman converts to Anabaptism, and he was actually rebaptized as an Anabaptist on January 5th, 1534. And so he prints leaflets, and his sermons get printed and circulated through Holland, Frisia, and northern Germany, and throughout 1533, thousands of people come to Munster with weapons they would need to defend the new kingdom of Zion. And in 1532 through 1533, there's constant conflict between the Prince Bishop Franz von Weldeck and the city leaders in Munster and the Anabaptists. And in June of 1533, Melchior Hoffman gets imprisoned. And one of his followers, a guy named Jan Matthias, takes over the leadership of a radical Anabaptist sect in the Low Countries, advocating violent rebellion. He kind of breaks away from the belief that Melchior Hoffman had in non-resistance. You've got these other guys that say that non-resistance is silly. We're going to get killed. Let's resist. And Melchior proclaims that Hoffman was wrong on the question of the exact time and place where Christ would return and reign. And he names Munster as the correct location and claims that it's going to be a year later in 1534. And so more people start coming to Munster. And in late 1533, we have there's many Anabaptists in Munster, and there's large-scale baptisms, and there's so many Anabaptists, in Munster that they become the majority. So in January of 1534, Jan Brockelson van Leiden, and most people just shorten it to Jan van Leiden. That means from the city of Leiden. Another follower of Melchior Hoffman arrives in Munster from Holland. In February 1534, Jan Matthias arrives in Munster, and he does a bunch of stuff. A new all-Anabaptist city council is formed, all right? So before, the city council was made up of locals, and now you've got, people that have really no invested interest in the city. They have a vested interest in their own religious fervor, all right? The Catholics and the Lutherans are actually driven out of the city. The exiled Prince Bishop Franz von Waldeck then sets up a blockade of Munster with his soldiers. So he's going to try to prevent more Anabaptists from getting into Munster. Two brothers get into Munster despite the blockade. Heinrich Kretsching, whom Jan van Leiden had lived with in a town of Schoppingen, which is like 20 miles northwest of Munster, and his younger brother Bernard. Now, Bernard becomes the chief of staff of Jan van Leiden, and Heinrich becomes kind of his chancellor, who is responsible for the defense of the city as this rebellion gets going. So all these people are now in Munster, and the stage is set for the rebellion. And you got to remember that the people that have come into Munster had been, as Anabaptists, had been used to persecution. They knew that, if they wanted to stay Anabaptist and weren't under the protection of Munster, if they got caught, they were going to be executed. So why not go to Munster and see if it's going to work, see if Jesus is going to return? So it takes about a year and a half for this rebellion to play out. And there's the book called The Tailor King goes into a great amount of detail on this rebellion. The audio-video resource that I put in the reference section goes into a lot of detail on this. We'll just kind of go month by month and look at kind of a summary of some of the things that had happened. Two radical Anabaptist followers of Hoffman, Jan van Matthias and Jan van Leiden, are in the city along with the existing Anabaptist converts. The bishop and his army are outside the city in blockade fashion. So you got the Anabaptists in this walled city. Outside of the city is the exiled Catholic bishop and his army. This is where things start to go crazy. The two Jans, Jan Matthias and Jan Leiden, used the pent-up aggression from the Peasants' Revolt and the Anabaptist persecution to wage war. So in March of 1534, Munster prepares for attack from the bishop's forces. Jan Matthias confiscates all the private property and wealth of the people that are in the town. He starts basing this on the fact that after Jesus went to heaven, all of the disciples and the people in Jerusalem had everything in common. I mean, some of their ideas are based on things they had read in the scriptures, but they take them to extreme. So a Munster blacksmith is murdered by John Leiden for resisting giving up his stuff. In April of 1534, which is Easter Sunday, Jan Matthias, one of the leaders, single-handedly challenges the bishop's army and is killed. So they believed that Jesus was going to return on Easter Sunday, 1534, and bring his angels and all this. So Jan Matthias says, that'll be a great time to go out and watch Jesus take care of the bishop, priest, and all these people that are fighting against us. Well, it didn't go as planned, and he rides out from Munster and is basically killed by the bishop's army. His body is brutally mutilated, and his head is displayed on a spike outside Munster, and parts of his body are actually nailed to the gates of Munster. The army and the bishop is trying to make an example of him, saying, you guys can't win. So Jan van Leiden assumes leadership. He disbands the council and appoints 12 elders to rule as in ancient Zion. All right, and Jan is the head of the council. Any opponents are imprisoned or executed. The church towers and steeples are destroyed, and the remains of them are used to shore up the city walls. So it's just chaos inside Munster. Buildings are being torn down to shore up the walls. And in May of 1534, the bishop has an attack on Munster, which fails. And so Jan, he is emboldened now. His dominance is strengthened. So in June of 1534, one of the Anabaptist ladies that's inside Munster, a Dutch girl named Haile Faken, she leaves the city on a mission to assassinate the bishop. This was based on the apocryphal book of Judith, where Judith had beheaded Holofernes, and she's captured and put to death. So in July 1534, Jan van Leiden forces the elders to decree that polygamy is both legal and desirable. So many of the men have been killed. There's so many women in town, and they decide that the only way they're going to make this work is if they get all the women pregnant, and you have to be polygamous in order to, legally, have multiple wives. He takes Matthias's widow and eventually marries 15 other women himself. So an internal rebellion breaks out because people don't want this polygamy. And Jan Leiden crushes this rebellion against polygamy, and scores of people inside Munster are executed for rebelling against Leiden. So in August of 1534, the bishop has a second attack, and it's repulsed. So the bishop begins construction of an impenetrable cordon around Munster. He starts putting up siege works and basically wants to prevent anybody from getting in or out of Munster, intending to starve the city into submission. Now, this is costing the bishop a huge amount of money because he's hired mercenaries, he's got this army he's supposed to be paying for, and in those days, this came out of your own pocket, if you were the bishop. So he's getting way into debt over this whole thing. So finally, in September 1534, Jan van Leiden proclaims himself king of Munster, king of the New Jerusalem, and he establishes his own court. All right, he sets up a throne in the city square, and he holds court. And anybody who opposes the dictator was crushed, including 2 women who were beheaded for opposing polygamy. All right. So in October of 1534, Leiden sends out teams of apostles, and I'm saying apostles in quotation marks here, into the neighboring cities to gather support. Most of these people are caught and executed by the bishop's army. All right. In November of 1534, the bishop's emissary is allowed to visit Munster and reports that Jan and his followers are determined to resist. And the bishop continues to intensify the siege. So you got the bishop still on the outside, all the crazy people on the inside of the city walls. So now it's 1535. In January, Jan makes an intensified effort to rouse support abroad. The Munster rebellion, however, is now opposed. It's known quite widely what's going on, and it's opposed by both Luther. I mean, Luther speaks out against this rebellion, as well as the peaceful Anabaptists in Holland. So they're getting this rebellion is getting a bad rap. In March, so the bishop has surrounded the city. He's not letting anything come in and out. They can't get any food. And the growing hunger and fear in Munster is made worse by the defection of a prominent aide to Jan, who sends a public letter denouncing him. And so Jan increases the terror inside Munster as people are executed for petty infractions. You're hungry, you steal some bread, you're executed for that. So it's getting crazy inside Munster. In April and May 1535, while Jan and his court live in luxury, thousands flee starvation and terror. So they're trying to get out of the city, but the bishop, who has the city surrounded, refuses to accept all these refugees. And so the refugees set up camp. They can't get back into the city. The bishop won't let them go out. So in this area between the siege walls and the city walls, these refugees are, they have nothing to do, but they set up little tents and stuff in this no man's land. It gets so bad that 2 Anabaptist guards defect, go across to the bishop's forces and reveal the plans for the city's defense. And that aids a third attack by the bishop's army. So in June of 1535, there is a night attack by the bishop's army, and it succeeds. All right? Hundreds of the bishop's soldiers get into Munster. Most of the Anabaptists in the city are killed, and Jan van Leiden and the other leaders are captured and imprisoned. So in June of 1535, basically the rebellion is squashed. So between July and December of 1535, Jan van Leiden and others are questioned, and they're actually encouraged to recant before their execution, of course. All right. So, so in January of 1536, Jan van Leiden, Bernard Kipperdoling, and Bernard Kretsching were cruelly tortured, and I'm not going to go into the details of their torture. It's pretty brutal. If you want to, listen to it, you can. I mean, most of those YouTube videos talk about the torture. That's, like the worst torture ever. They're tortured for, at least an hour, and then put to death. So the whole idea there is to make an example of these guys. So to make this example, this is the aftermath of the rebellion. This picture on the left is actually the picture that that Andy showed me a year and a half ago, because he went into Google Maps, typed in the name of the church, and you can go down to street level in Google Maps, and where I've circled that in red are these 3 cages that are on the right. And the bodies of Jan van Leiden, Bernard Kipperdoling, and Bernard Kretsching were stuck in these cages and hung there until there was nothing left of their bodies. And the church and the city council that were there with the bishop coming back into town decided to leave the cages there, and they're still there today. Evidently, they've been rebuilt or cleaned up, but they're still there. So people go to Munster just to see these cages, I guess. So in the city of Munster, let me get to there. What happened after the Munster rebellion was squashed? So I found a document in the society, and it's called In Society and Religion in Munster, 1535 to 1618, Yale University Press. And in the conclusion section of this, it says, of the complexity of changes between 1535 and 1618, there were but two essential developments. First, the conflict between city and territorial state, and closely associated with it, the tensions between the different forms of religiosity. Second, the gradual but successful implementation of the Counter-Reformation and its impact on the lives of the people. The half-century after the defeat of the Anabaptists saw a successful accommodation between Catholics and Protestants in Munster. After 1555, Lutherans could reside, though not worship, in Munster, and even the once feared Anabaptists, which were now pacifist Mennonites, were no longer hunted down. And so in Munster, there was an atmosphere of religious tolerance. And the Catholic Counter-Reformation is what this reference to 1555 is referring to. And is that the Council of Trent? So the Council of Trent, the Catholics, you know, after Lutheran and the Anabaptists, they decide that they need to clean up their act. And so Andy, I assume at some point we'll be talking about the Council of Trent. So will that be before or after John Knox? Or Calvin, I mean.
That's actually going to be a part of the rise of denominationalism.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah, the Catholic Counter-Reformation plays on the fact that the Protestants can't get along, as showing that Catholicism is the right way to go. And look, we've cleaned up all these excesses and vices and, you know, wrong doctrines. But that's for another day.
That's for another day, yes. So I got to thinking about what characterized the leadership in the city of Munster, and, you know, how was it that you had these people with such crazy ideas? And there was a kind of a common thread. And this started, this kind of thinking that I had when Andy was going through like Luther and Zwingli and talking about these people that were incredibly educated and intelligent people. And so I decided, okay, well, let's look at this and see if there's a pattern. So I looked at, so last week I had displayed a list of kind of the major players in the Reformation. And so what I did is I took that list and I decided, well, let's figure out what their education was. And I wanted just to mention that to you this morning. So starting with John Wycliffe, all right? He attended Oxford University, where he earned a doctorate in divinity, all right? So smart guy, John Wycliffe. Jan Hus, all right? He received a master's degree in 1394, and he was a candidate for the doctor's degree in theology, all right? Smart guy, went to school. I've got other information here, but I don't want to get that deep into it. So Thomas Kempis attended the Latin school at Deventer. Kempis took his vows in 1407. He was ordained a priest in 1413. In 1429, he became the sub-prior of this community and spent the rest of his life there. This is the guy that wrote the devotional, The Imitation of Christ. And this little booklet, The Imitation of Christ, I actually downloaded this. And one of these days I'll try to read it, because what I found was The Imitation of Christ is perhaps the most widely read Christian devotional work after the Bible. Kind of hard to believe. After the first printed edition in 1471, it was printed in 745 editions before 1650. Apart from the Bible, no book had been translated into more languages than the Imitation of Christ at that time. You know, so you've got a guy here who is intelligent, and he's writing a book that is widely accepted. Gabriel Biel in 1432. He enters the Heidelberg University to obtain a bachelor's degree. He attends the University of Erfurt, then the University of Cologne, and returns to Erfurt in 1451 to finish. Erasmus, all right? Erasmus went to the best Latin schools in the Netherlands, and he was ordained a Catholic priest in April 25th of 1492. He studied and taught at the University of Oxford for a while. He lectured at the Queen's College. He succeeded in mastering Greek by an intensive day and night study of 3 years, and was taught by Thomas Lincoln. Again, Erasmus was a pretty smart guy. Martin Luther. Luther has a master's degree from the University of Erfurt in 1505, and he had studied philosophy and law. And he then enters the monastery. Afterwards, he gets his bachelor's degree from the University of Wittenberg, and in 1512, he was awarded his doctorate of theology. So, Martin Luther, educated guy. Ulrich Zwingli, he attended the University of Vienna, the University of Basel, where he received the Master of Arts degree in 1506. So Zwingli is an educated guy. Michael Sattler, he was the Swiss Anabaptist that we talked about last week. He was educated at the University of Freiburg, and he became a Benedictine monk. So he's got education. William Tyndale, all right, he was educated at the Oxford University and got his bachelor's in 1512 and his master's in 1515. So Tyndale, smart guy. Menno Simons, after whom the Mennonites are named. Simons was enrolled in a monastic school at an early age. He soon learned both Latin and Greek and became a scholar with interests in humanism and theology. Simons was ordained as Catholic priest around 1515. John Calvin, who Andy's going to talk about next week, right? He was educated at the University of Paris. Later at the University of Orleans, he went to study law. He entered the University of Borns in 1529. And Calvin got his law degree and his law license in 1532. Another smart guy, John Knox in Scotland. He studied at the University of St. Andrews, or possibly the University of Glasgow, Knox was ordained a Catholic priest in Edinburgh in 1536. And so all these people that are famous for their beliefs that went through the Reformation are highly educated, intelligent people. All right? So let's look at the people who were involved in Munster. All right? This preacher, Melchior Hoffman, was a lay preacher with no scholarly training at all. He's a self-proclaimed prophet, and he's getting visions, you know, and he's the guy that thought that Christ would return to Strasbourg in 1533 and set up the New Jerusalem, which never happened. Okay, so this guy Bernard Rothman, he actually had some theological training, and he did visit Wittenberg, became a friend of Philip Melanchthon, who was a companion of Luther. So there was at least one guy in Munster who with some training, but Rothman converts to Anabaptism and is part of this revolt. So the two Jans, Jan Matthias was a baker, all right? And he converted to Anabaptism through the ministry of the first guy we just mentioned, Melchior Hoffman. No scholastic, no college, no nothing. He's a baker. Jan van Leiden, all right, this is the guy who declares himself King Jan. He was and the book calls him the tailor king, but he wasn't really a tailor. He was an apprentice tailor. He was also a brothel keeper and an actor, all right? So he knew how to talk, but no scholarly training. Bernard Kipperdoling, all right, he's one of the other guys that are hanging in these cages. He was the son of a wealthy patrician cloth merchant in Munster, and he was a guild leader, but he had no education and no theological training. Bernard Kretsching, one of the other guys in the basket, hanging from the church. He did receive higher education, became a priest, and he was tutor and a pastor in the county of Bentheim. So you have two guys in Munster, part of this rebellion, that have some theological background. Kretsching, who had become kind of the chief of staff of King Jan, he gets murdered and hung in the cage. The other guy, Bernard Rothman, no one knows what happened to him. Some people think that maybe he was killed along with all the other Anabaptists when the bishop invaded Munster. Others think that he escaped. There's rumors, that people thought he was going to rise from the dead. There's all kinds of crazy stuff around these guys. And so the last thing I thought of, because in the book, The Tailor King, in the conclusion in the book, he talks about some more recent events and some more recent people. And so I made a list of my own of more recent events and recent people. Well, these aren't all recent. So when I was still at home with my parents, because I remember my father coming home from work, and everybody was joking. Somebody had brought to the office a pitcher of pink Kool-Aid, all right? And it was all about the Jim Jones massacre in Jonestown. Jim Jones had no formal theological training. His childhood was unsupervised. He happened to have been baptized as a Nazarene. He was a good student in high school, but he studied Hitler, Stalin, Marx, Gandhi, Mao Zedong, and loved Nazism. So, I mean, this guy who started Jonestown was a Nazi. So later, you have David Koresh, all right? David Koresh was the whole Waco, Texas massacre. He had no formal theological training. He had a bad childhood. He was raised by his grandparents. His mother was an unmarried 14-year-old. He never even met his father until he was 17 years old. He worked as a carpenter, all right? He's a self-proclaimed prophet. How about Adolf Hitler, all right? Hitler had no formal education. His only education was in the military, all right? How about the founder of the religion Islam, Muhammad? Muhammad had no education of any kind, all right? So on the Islam website, they call him the unschooled prophet. And here's in quotes, this is right off their website. One of the highlights in the life of the great prophet Muhammad is the fact that he was untrained and unschooled. For example, he did not attend any school. He had not been trained by any teacher, and neither had he acquired himself any written work. So you got this guy who's getting visions, can't even read, all right? He can't even write this stuff. He has to dictate it to somebody else. What about the founder of the Jehovah's Witnesses, Charles Taze Russell? He founded the Zion's Watchtower Tract Society in 1881. He attended public school for 7 years, left around 14 years old. He got sued for some business dealings he was in, and in his what was I going to say here? In his cross-examination, all right, this is what Russell himself said. He was instructed through private tutors, versed in Latin to an extent, but no Hebrew or Greek, never ordained by any bishop or minister, never attended a theological seminary or any school of higher learning. So he had education through basically for 7 years. Joseph Smith of the Mormons. Joseph received only 3 years of schooling. I mean, that's like being in the 3rd grade. All right. Along with his brothers and sisters, he was educated mainly at home from the family Bible. And so you've got religious leaders, not only in Munster, but throughout history, and other historical people like Hitler, who, write books, dictate visions, and the majority of them, all of them basically, that I looked at, have absolutely no theological training, no background in what they're claiming to, have the truth. Do they have the truth? Absolutely not. So, that's my conclusion from the Munster Rebellion, is that when you let people that don't know what they're saying, that don't know what they're doing, be in control, all kinds of crazy stuff can happen, all right? And if we're not careful in this country, the same thing is going to happen, So anyway, that's my
Yeah, but
lesson
I think,
on
I think
Munster.
Jude would agree with you, Brother Steve, because he wanted to write more concerning the gospel, but he found it necessary to write once again to contend for the faith once for all delivered to the saints. Right? So that biblical truth played right back out over and over again with everything you've taught today.
Yeah. So let's close with a word of prayer. Father, thank you that in this congregation we have Pastor Andy, who is trained and who loves your word and follows you to the letter. Lord, we thank you that we have history to teach us the difference between right and wrong and what happens when the wrong people get into control. And we just thank you that that we can learn from your word, and ask that you would bless this time that we've had together this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you for coming, and